The bone knife found its home beneath Dorian's jaw before the scream could leave his throat. He had been turning toward Elira, his hand half raised in that foolish, desperate gesture of peace that men offer to monsters whose hearts are already set upon slaughter. Hot blood broke across her fingers, and in the dying light of his eyes, there was no accusation, a grace that tore at her spirit far more than blame ever could. The nightmare did not end when she woke, but merely shifted its shape. Elira gasped back a strangled breath, her hands lashing out in the dark to drive her steel into the mattress before her waking mind could arrest the blow. Above her loomed the heavy, soot-stained timbers of an unfamiliar ceiling. The air was bitter, the silence profound. This was Lasker's Ford, not the haunted stones of Old Kraven. Yet her pulse hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and for many long minutes she sat motionless upon the narrow cot, one hand white-knuckled upon the hilt beneath her pillow, the other pressed hard against her lips to force the memory back into the dark. It was not the first phantom to haunt her slumber, such a singularity would have been a mercy. The first had claimed her on the night of her grim return, when sheer exhaustion had dragged her into the abyss before grief could find its proper form. In that first dream, Dorian had lived until the precise moment of the strike. The second dream had altered the shadows and shifted the corridors, yet the ending remained immutable. The same blade, the same profound helplessness. But this night had been the most terrible, for her mind no longer feigned surprise. The nightmares were growing wiser, they were learning efficiency. Beyond the thin walls of the inn, a cart rattled over warped timber and a drunkard bellowed into the gray dawn. The world of men was turning, heedless of her sorrow. Elira swung her legs to the cold floor, breathing through a rise where Dorian died without end. Waking was merely the brief, agonizing intermission before the curtain rose again. And there, upon the small table beside her bed, lay the carved bone charm she had taken from the flesh of the slain thing. Even in the shadows, her eyes were drawn to it, anchored by an unnatural gravity. Lasker's Ford held no mourning for Dorian. That was the first bitterness that tasted of ash upon Elira's tongue. The settlement awoke to its customary, ugly rhythm, wagons groaning under the weight of rusted salvage, teamsters cursing their stubborn beasts, and scavengers bickering over broken iron as though each scrap were a relic blessed by the gods. Smoke drifted like gray shrouds between the leaning roofs, and from an alley nearby came the low, ugly murmur of a gambling debt being settled with threats. Life endured, indifferent and coarse. To Elira, it felt like an obscenity. Yet, eyes followed her now. Not with the open theater of pity, for the frontier was too well acquainted with the grave to weep for common tragedy. Men were swallowed by the deep caves every winter, traders vanished into the mist of the bad roads, the marsh fever claimed its tribute every season. But Old Kraven was a name spoken in whispers. And she was the woman who had walked out of its gates alone. The glances pricked her back as she moved through the market. Some were softened by sympathy, others sharpened by curiosity, but a few were dark with caution. She purchased her provisions. Heavy rope, oil, dried meat, whetstones, and fuel for her lamps, offering no words to invite familiarity. When a broad-shouldered merchant ventured to ask after her brother, she fixed him with a gaze so hollow and unblinking that the man quickly decided ignorance was a safer companion than persistence. She had told herself that routine would mend the fractures of her mind. Instead, Every common task became a monument to parrying the merchant's prices with grand, foolish jests or clumsily pocketing dried fruit he had no hope of stealing cleanly. By the time the sun dipped below the marshes, the truth lay bare before her. She was not rebuilding a life. She was merely delaying a reckoning. The carved charm sat upon the table long after the sun had died and the torches were lit. By all rights, it should have been nothing. A crude bauble of bone and knotted cord, ugly enough to be overlooked in a place like Lasker's Ford, where half the populace wore cheap superstitions around their wrists to beg the world to forget them. But this token had been taken from the breast of the creature that ripped the life from Dorian. That truth gave it a terrible weight. Elira turned the object over in her scarred palms, tracing the smooth, worn contours of the bone. Someone had carried this through long years. Someone had touched it in moments of dread. Someone had cherished it enough to keep it close. It was the word someone that chilled her blood. When morning broke, she sought out Varric. The old salvage dealer looked like a man constructed entirely from vice and the unnatural luck required to survive it. He received the charm in silence, rolling it between his calloused fingers with the slow, agonizing deliberation of a scholar weighing an ancient curse. "Where did you unearth this?" he asked, his voice like grinding stones. Elira remained as still as stone. Varric's eyes lifted, seeing her truly for the first time, the dark hollows of exhaustion beneath her brow, the fading bruises upon her skin, the rigid posture of a soul that had forsaken rest. He set the charm down upon the counter, more gently than he had ever handled gold. "This did not belong to a beast," he said softly. The words struck her like a physical blow. Until that moment, she had not realized how desperately she had hoped for a contradiction. Varric murmured. That was all the certainty she required. Before the sun had reached its zenith, her packs were strapped to her back. The hooded traveler marked her stride, for grief alters the very rhythm of a person's movement. It strips away the hesitations of caution, it narrows the sight to a single point, it lends a terrible resonance to silence itself. He had slipped into Lasker's Ford under a name designed to be forgotten, paying his coin without complaint or conversation. To the locals, he appeared to be merely another veteran of the long wars, drifting south after the Empire had spent the best of his youth. The guess was near enough to the truth. Ser Garanvale had learned in the crucible of campaigns that heavy armor invited unwanted glances, whereas anonymity invited the truth. He had not come to the Black Coast in search of Elira. He had come chasing whispers, fragments of old lore, tales of unnatural lights dancing in the fens, missing caravans, and ancient ruins that the local folk avoided even in the heat of midday. These were reports too wild to credit, yet too persistent to disregard. Then, the name of Old Kraven began to stir in the taverns. Then came word of a scavenger woman who had survived its depths alone. And finally, rumors of a carved token wrenched from the flesh of a nightmare. From the deep shadow of a corner table, Garan watched her cross the common room. She moved with the clean, terrifying purpose of an arrow loosed from a bow. There was no hesitation in her step, no sorrow that any man might interrupt. There was only intent. When she stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, Garan allowed her the distance of a prudent huntsman. The road to Old Kraven lay insultingly serene beneath the pale light of midday. No unnatural mists rose to choke the breath, no ominous silence hung over the path, no ancient malice pressed against the temples. There was only the broken, miserable track of the frontier, the gray expanse of the marsh, thorn scrub clinging to the stones, and the wheeling of gulls above the bleak shores of the Black Coast. Elira despised the normalcy of it. How could a place so common conceal the horror she had looked upon? The hours marched on beneath a leaden sky. At long last, the silhouette of Old Kraven rose against the horizon, jagged and broken, like a shattered crown that the earth had tried and failed to swallow. Her pace slowed. Her body remembered the terror before her mind could master it. There. That was the ground that had drunk Dorian's life. Her fingers tightened around the bone charm in her tunic until the sharp edges drew blood from her palm. For the space of a single breath, the thought of turning back whispered in her ear. Then it passed. Behind her, far enough to remain a ghost among the rocks, Garan looked upon the same ruin. But within his breast stirred something colder than a woman's memory. It was the chill of recognition. Old Kraven was a more terrible thing in the sunlight than ever it had been in the dark. The brightness did not cleanse it merely exposed its wrongness. The outer courtyard lay drowned in silence, strewn with broken pillars and the debris of centuries, yet the stillness did not speak of abandonment. It spoke of a great beast drawing its breath, waiting. Elira crossed the threshold with a measured tread, her blade already naked in her hand. She had not returned for salvage, nor even for the cold comfort of revenge. She was there because the unanswered questions had become a torment she could not long in appearing. Footprints were preserved in places where no wind should have spared them. Strange, deep scratches were scored into the ancient masonry, and fragments of shaped bone lay discarded in the dirt. This was no mere den where beasts wandered in the night. This was a dwelling. Near the mouth of a descending stair, she found a series of markings carved into the wall. They were crude, yet entirely deliberate. A pattern repeated with grim intent, far removed from the random damage of time. A sound drifted up from the depths, the dry scrape of leather on stone. Then, the silence closed in again. Elira straightened, her muscles tightening. The fortress knew its guest had returned. Note 7. When panic is mastered, details emerge with a cruel clarity, and those details made the world a darker place. The upper corridors were familiar enough. The stark, utilitarian stonework of an imperial outpost, built for the discipline of legions rather than the pride of kings. But as she descended, the architecture began to forget the empire. The stone blocks grew massive, ancient, and fitted together with a seamless, pre-human precision. The arches above her changed their curves, becoming elegant and sinister. The empire had not founded this place. They had merely built over it. Elira stepped into a vast, collapsed hall where the remnants of primeval reliefs still clung stubbornly to soot-blackened walls. A sudden movement caught her eye. A gray, lithe figure vanished through a ruptured doorway. She spun, her steel catching the dim light, only to see another shape lingering in the shadows further back. It did not spring. It did not roar. It merely watched her with pale, unblinking more terrible than any sudden violence. These things were capable of counsel. They were making decisions. Then a deeper rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the world, the groan of massive stone shifting far below, like an ancient mechanism awakening after an age of sleep. For the first time since she had buckled her pack, Elira wondered if her return to this place had been a catastrophic error. They should have turned back. That truth became a certainty the moment the words died in the air. The passages ahead narrowed into a gray twilight where the very breath of the earth felt alien, colder, drier, bearing the scent of a tomb that had never known the sun. All trace of imperial workmanship had vanished. Whatever this labyrinth had been in the elder days, the conquerors of the north had merely buried it beneath their own ramparts and called the deceit a fortress. Elira moved beside Gartran in the pressing dark, their single torch casting long, dancing shadows across walls etched with symbols that possessed no meaning for her eyes. But to Gartran, they seemed to speak a language he wished he had never learned. He halted beside a breach where massive bars of corrupted iron protruded from the stone. They were not the hinges of a gate, nor the braces of a vault. They were locking mechanisms, forged on a scale that defied reason. Elira looked upon them, her voice dropping to a whisper. This was no garrison. No, Gartran replied, his voice flat. Then what did the Empire build upon? Gartran ran his gloved hand over the pitted iron. A cage. The word seemed to drop into the dark like a stone into a deep well. A fortress built to defend a border was a thing a soldier could understand. A fortress constructed solely to keep something from clawing its way out of the earth was another matter. They found the remnants of warnings chiseled into the stone, but the script had been systematically destroyed. The marks of heavy hammers and cold chisels crossed the walls with methodical fury. Someone had sought to murder the memory of this place. Why break the stones? Elira asked. Why hide the warning? Garen's face remained a mask in the torchlight. Because warnings invite the very questions we are asking now. Then, from the deep dark below, where neither light nor sane men belonged, a sound answered them, a low, mechanical grinding that shook the dust from the roof. The vault opened before them so vast that the reach of their torch could not find its limits. It was a space defined only by its shadows. Yet it was not the emptiness that chilled Elira, it was the evidence of design. Great platforms of black stone loomed out of the dark, collapsed walkways hung like broken webs over the abyss. and deep channels had been cut into the floor to direct the flow of things unnamed. This was no cavern born of nature's whim. This had required the labor of thousands, the geometry of scholars, and a purpose grander than any frontier legend could encompass. The gray dwellers of the dark did not appear, and that absence was a heavier burden than an assault. Silence in the deep places of the world is rarely a token of peace. Garan stepped forward with a slow, measured gait, the smooth efficiency of the veteran replaced by the profound caution of a man who knows he has walked into a trap. Elira saw the change in him. "What is this place, knight?" "Something that was old when the first emperor was in his cradle," he murmured.
Then her
It was
eyes
an answer
found the
that
wall.
brought no comfort. Scores had been etched into the stone, cluster upon cluster, thousands of lines stretching into the high darkness. A tally of years, perhaps. Or the record of a watch that had lasted generations. The air grew thick, pregnant with the psychic residue of ancient suffering, as though the stone itself had remembered the agonies performed in its presence. Garan stopped dead. "Look there." Ahead, suspended from a bracket of black iron that should have rusted to dust an age ago, a lantern burned. Elira froze, her breath catching in her throat. For she knew that lantern. She knew its shape, its make, and the unholy light it cast. For a long time, neither broke the silence. The flame within the glass burned with a patient, unnatural steadiness. The very same light that Elira had heard of in the campfire tales of Old Kraven, and the very same light that Garan had seen in the dark chapters of his own past. The dust of centuries should have smothered it. The oil should have dried to crust before the empire drew its first borders. Reason demanded that the flame be dead. Yet it hung there, pristine and luminous. "It cannot be," Elira whispered. "And yet it is." The absolute certainty in the knight's voice made her turn upon him. "You have looked upon its like before." It was no question. His silence was a confession more absolute than words. A new dread crept into her heart. What manner of man was this companion, who walked among wonders and horrors as though they were old acquaintances? "What is the nature of this flame?" she demanded. "I do not know," Garan said, and for the first time, his words sounded entirely honest. He drew near, his long sword clearing its scabbard by an inch, every muscle coiled to strike. The flame did not waver at his approach. No hidden counterweight dropped, no snare sprung from the floor. There was only that awful, peaceful light shining to the stones nearby. The wall was scored with deep, frantic furrows, the marks of human fingers that had torn themselves to the bone against the rock. They had not been trying to reach the light. They had been clawing at the stone in a desperate madness to escape whatever stood beyond it. "Garan," she breathed. He saw them. His jaw set. Then came the first sound, a dry, slithering scrape from the dark. Then another. Then a chorus of them, rising from every quarter of the vault. They were moving with a terrible velocity, coordinated, silent, and coming for the light. The onslaught was no blind rush of beasts, it was a deployment. From the black mouths of a dozen tunnels, the troglodytes swarmed into the vault. They moved with a swiftness that turned the shadows into a sea of thrashing limbs. There were dozens, perhaps scores. Computation died the moment the cold necessity of survival took its place. They did not charge with the mindless fury of brutes. They moved in silence, spreading out to encircle, driving the intruders back with the practiced skill of a huntsman folding a net. Bone weapons gleamed in the yellow torchlight, points of scavenged iron, spears of hardened wood, and heavy clubs bound with the sinew of the dead. Garan stepped into the path of the storm. His great blade moved in disciplined, terrible arcs, killing without a wasted breath or a spent motion. He was a machine of war, seasoned by 100 fields. Elira fought at his shoulder, her daggers flashing faster than thought, her movements dictated by the raw instinct of the prey. There was no rage in her now, no wild madness of the blood. There was only a cold, lunged low at her knees, while a third leapt from a ruined ledge above. Garen's blade took the first through the breast before its feet hit the ground. Elira's steel tore the throat from the second. The third nearly found her neck before the knight's backhand stroke severed its arm at the shoulder. Yet for every one that fell, 3 crept from the dark. They were pressing them, systematically, ruthlessly, forcing them away from the deeper vaults and toward the stair. "Retreat." Garen's voice boomed over the din. It was not the cry of panic, but the iron command of a captain. And despite the pride that burned within her, Elira obeyed. It was a submission that would taste like bile when she remembered it later, but in that dark hour, it kept the breath in her lungs. A retreat through the guts of a ruined world is merely a noble name for madness. They fought their way backward through the narrowing tunnels, the creatures hanging upon their flanks like wolves, never allowing them a moment to draw breath or steady their footing. The troglodytes knew the terrain. They used every crack and fallen pillar with a terrifying familiarity. A jagged spear struck the stone an inch from Elira's temple, showering her face with sharp flint. Another beast dropped from a ventilation shaft, its weight bearing her down toward a yawning chasm where the floor had fallen away. Only Garen's gauntlet hand, catching her collar and heaving her clear, saved her from the long fall. Moments later, a massive beam of rotted cedar split above them, and it was Elira who drove her shoulder into the night to thrust him clear of the crushing timber. Neither spoke a word of thanks. Survival had consumed the world. Elira shouted over the hissing of the creatures. Aye. Then why do they follow? Why do they not let us go? Garen clove a pale skull in twain and answered without turning his head. Because now we know what they guard. A section of the vaulted roof collapsed behind them with a roar like thunder, burying their immediate pursuers in a tomb of granite, but new shapes emerged from the side fissures almost before the dust could settle. There were too many. The dark was alive with them. Then, their boots struck the smooth stone of the lantern chamber once more. And there, Garen stopped. What madness takes you? Elira cried, her torch sputtering. Garen gave no answer. The lantern hung precisely as they had left it, its impossible flame burning with that same maddening, serene light while the world around it descended into blood and iron. If this relic was the heart of the place, breaking it might break the spell. If it was nothing but an ancient lamp, they were already food for the crows. It was the sort of wager the knight understood. He seized the black iron frame, tore it from its ancient mounting with a snarl of iron, and drove it with all his might against the stone wall. The glass shattered into 1,000 shards. The oil splattered across the masonry. The flame died instantly. Elira braced herself, her eyes closing, waiting for the earth to tear itself open, for the sky to fall, or for some great voice to scream from the abyss. Nothing happened. There was no thunderous echo, no magical recoil, no shift in the ancient air. No ancient god groaned in the deep. The troglodytes did not even pause. If anything, the darkness seemed to embolden them, and they came on with renewed ferocity. Garen stared at the oily stain upon the wall for one fatal fraction of a second. It was not failure that had unnerved him. It was the utter saved his life. A bone-tipped spear passed through the air where his throat had been a heartbeat prior. Then, the cold reality of the blade reclaimed them both. They won their way out of Old Kraven by a measure of skill and a measure of fortune, a combination that Garen privately disdained as unacceptable mathematics. When they finally tumbled through the broken gates into the open air, they were bleeding from a dozen small wounds, their lungs burning, their breath coming in the ragged gasps of hunted creatures. Behind them, the ancient fortress stood silent under the dying light of the western sky, as unchanged and patient as though their little storm had been nothing but the passing of a breeze. Elira bent double, her hands upon her knees, forcing the clean air of the coast into her chest. For a long time, the only sound was the whistling of the wind through the hollow stones and the distant, lonely cry of gulls disputing some worthless prize upon the shore. The common world felt thin and unreal. Finally, she straightened her spine and looked at the man beside her. What dwells in the roots of that place, knight? Garen did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the dark maw of the keep. Not at the imperial walls, nor the broken battlements, but lower, past the stone, past the foundations of the world, toward that ancient cage that memory had tried to erase. When he spoke, his voice was devoid of the doubt she had expected. It possessed the cold certainty of a chronicle. Old Kraven was never built to defend the borders of the Empire, he said. Elira waited, the wind stirring her hair. His eyes never wavered from the stone. It was built to keep what is down there from coming up.